Hello and welcome to Tales from the Pit, the behind-the-lens access to the entertainment world and the creative people involved. Today we're talking mastering with one of the best in the industry. You have several Grammys. You have 67 albums that you've worked on that have won awards and all kinds of stuff. Just incredible background of work. Almost any artist you mention, you've probably touched or tuned their album in one way or another. Adam Ayan, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Awesome. And also I want to add that we have in the co-host seat, we have again, WSCA mixtape host Bonnie joining us. Thank you, Bonnie, for joining us.
Hello. Welcome, Adam. It's nice to meet you.
Hey, Bonnie. Nice to meet you too.
So to get started, Bonnie and I are going to be doing a little tag team on questions on all your work because you have so much to talk about. But before we get started, can you kind of give us a background? Maybe was music in your childhood? How did you get started? What was sort of your background, your history, if you will?
Sure. Certainly music was in my childhood, and being a kid that grew up in the 80s, there was a lot of time spent in front of the television watching MTV. I definitely mark that as sort of one of those points in my life where I was like, this is really cool. This is something I want to be part of. So music was definitely always part of my childhood. Became a musician in my early teens and really, felt at that point I wanted to be a professional musician. I mean, I really wanted to be in a rock band that toured the world when I was, 16, 17 years old. And I had this great experience with one of the many bands that I played in, making a demo recording and spending basically a weekend in a studio making I think it was a 4 or 5 track demo. And walked away from that thinking, well, that was a lot of fun. I don't know a lot about that, but it was a lot of fun. And so when time came to decide what I was going to do, after high school, I thought, well, I still want to be a performing musician. I thought I'd be a professional musician. I started really opening up sort of my purview in terms of what I could do. So I always played in rock bands and that was my love. But then I started playing in the jazz band at school or, playing in the pit orchestra for musicals and learning how to sight reading, doing all these other things to really be a professional musician. But the University of Massachusetts at Lowell, where I went to college, had this really great recording program that's part of a music performance program. So I thought, well, maybe I'll do both of those things. That gives me yet another, tool in my toolbox. And once I started getting into the recording side of it and the audio side of music and the music industry, I sort of, I continued to play, make it through all of what I needed to get my performance degree along with my recording degree. But really my focus just completely changed to being an engineer and helping other musicians get the sounds that they want on tape, so to speak, and out there into the greater world. So what was your instrument of choice back then? Bass guitar. Bass. Oh, still is. It's funny. I want to say the last 2 interviews were bassists that are now working as something else in the music industry. Whether it is kidding. Front of house or tour manager, whatever. It just happened to be coincidence that the last 2 people I've interviewed were bass guitarists as well. That's awesome. Well, I think that there's something to that. I know a lot of bass guitarists that went on to be engineers or producers. Yeah. I think that we're used to being the utility players. We're used to being able to manage a lot of things. And so it makes sense that there are a lot of bass players out there in the world doing things other than just playing their bass in the music business. Yeah. I mean, realistically, the bass and the drums are the foundation. So Absolutely. It totally makes sense that would be, the branch off for the industry stuff. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And ask me about that again when we start talking a little bit more about mastering, because it's a really, in my opinion, a really important part of the overall picture of a recording that that folks don't always consciously pick up on. We can talk about that later.
So what was your entry into mastering? Were you just, were you an engineer just, as an intern or whatever? How did you start mastering?
Yeah, so I was an engineer while I was still in school, not only as a student, but I was working as a multi-track engineer at a small recording studio. But really, one of the things that I credit with finding and following this path was this international organization known as the Audio Engineering Society. It's kind of like our professional, international organization for audio people, audio nerds like me. And we had a student chapter at Lowell at UMass. And my senior year, I was the president of that student chapter. And my main gig was to ask professionals to come in and speak to the student body for the chapter. I think we did it on a monthly basis every semester. And so I found like a really great swath of different industry professionals that were really gracious with their time and came and spoke. And so anybody that I asked, it was a great overview of the entire recording industry, because anybody that I asked, I'd learn as much as I could about them. These were super early days of the internet. Like, there was no Google. I was Googling on Alta Vista. There were very few websites about any of this stuff. But what ended up being serendipitous was that Bob Ludwig, who had opened Gateway Mastering here in Portland, I'd been in Portland for a couple of years at that point, and I had asked him if he'd come and speak because he had this legendary career. I thought it'd be a great guest to have. And he was really gracious with his time and said he would. So I did all this research on mastering before reaching out to him, after reaching out to him, even tried to intern for him, but they didn't do internships. But that really piqued my interest for mastering. And from there on, I ended up doing an internship at a place called MWorks Mastering that was in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time, while I was working as a recording engineer. And I just really fell in love with the art of mastering and really felt like this is actually my place in terms of engineering within the music business. So I pretty much very quickly got into mastering. In fact, got into Gateway at 22 years old after having a couple of years of professional experience under my belt, and was just full bore. That was my main focus, was I'm going to be a mastering engineer and do this, for as long as people will keep asking me to do it.
Nice.
So I have a quick question I want to follow up with. So, for anybody who wants to get into what you're doing, right, and be good like you, first a question about, do you hear the world differently because you're a master? You know what I mean? Like, you hear things. Do you hear them differently than like me or Jason? Or what makes you so good at being, what takes you to a master level engineer?
So I think that, number one, I think that if you're any type of audio engineer, I think that I would say that the three of us are probably the outliers in general. Like, we probably all hear music and recording differently than most folks, given that we all have such a hand in it in different ways. But I think that number one, when you start to learn to listen the way any recording engineer, let alone a mastering engineer, does, it is like you hear the world. You certainly hear the recorded world, the audio world, more differently than anybody else. You're more just in sync and in tune with sound in that way. And then specifically as a mastering engineer, one of the things I love about it is instead of looking real, at least in terms of the aspect of a recording, instead of looking real micro, like I loved working with microphones, putting microphones on drums and amplifiers and getting sounds that way. That's sort of more of a micro view of the overall thing. What I loved and what spoke to me about mastering, and this probably goes back to even my early days of like watching MTV and just listening to music, listening to records, is like you get this macro view, you hear the whole thing, but then you're affecting it in a very micro way, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So I think specifically as a mastering engineer, it's more about real fine tuning that is even yet a different way of listening to recordings than even a recording engineer does. But same with a recording engineer or a record producer. I think that once you start to hear and listen to recordings critically and start to make artistic and creative judgments that way, you end up starting to hear everything differently than, say, the layperson that doesn't do that kind of work. It's really interesting, and I've worked with and mentored a lot of younger engineers And when you start seeing them hit that aha moment of like, they're really just hearing things differently, they can tell, like they listen to the radio, they're not listening quite the same way anymore. They listen to their records at home, they're not listening quite the same way. Usually at the beginning, it starts to make you a little crazy because you overthink it a little too much, and it makes it harder at times to listen to music for enjoyment. And then hopefully, I found myself at least early on being able to get over that hump, because it's like, I don't want to always be listening to records and be, thinking about the sonics without enjoying the song. So I can sort of turn that off to a certain degree. But yes, you listen to things very, very differently. And specifically as a mastering engineer, it's really about all this like really fine-tuned minutia stuff that really adds up to making big, big differences. Like if I were to play you sort of a before and after of a mix versus a master, in most instances, there's a big difference between the two because, I mean, number one, a lot of mix engineers like to leave creative room for mastering engineers, which we appreciate. And then what we do is such a creative part of the process that it's more than you would think, but it's usually a bunch of these little micro things that you're doing that add up to the final mastered product.
Oh, so I can see this is a whole different thing if we're listening to a record together. You'd be like, did you hear that?
Right.
Did you hear that?
Well, I will. I promise I wouldn't.
I just want to listen to the song.
No, I promise I wouldn't do that to you and ruin the experience, though. And I try to sort of turn it off for myself as well, so I can continue to enjoy it. It does get a little bothersome when I hear an artist I really like, and I'm like, dang, if somebody gave me the go at this, I might have been able to, make a little more out of it than what I'm hearing. But, thankfully, there are some other really good mastering engineers out there, too. So
then the other question that I had, too, was relating to schooling.
Yeah.
So you mentioned UMass Lowell. Can you do what you do without, like, where'd you really learn the art of what you know how to do? Was it in school or was it the experience that came after?
It was mostly it's a combination of the two, because I don't want to diminish the importance of the school education, but, what you learn in the classroom and even, in the lab, so to speak, which in my case and at UMass would be in the studios, you learn a lot. You learn a lot of those creative things. But like anything else, it takes a long time to really learn it. So I looked at the schooling as building a foundation of principles of audio and recording and opening my ears to critical listening and the start of all those things. And then the professional life was where you really, you really grind and you work hard and you start to really pick up on it. And specifically mastering too, because it's so specialized. I mean, when I went to school, there weren't any classes about mastering. Like it was barely even touched upon. These days, that's a little different. Most of the institutions that have recording programs might even have a class on mastering or some portion of a class dedicated to it. But because it is such a very niche part of the industry, you're not going to get a lot out of school. What I found for me was getting out in the world and doing it. And then, of course, having a great mentor I wanted to go to a world-class mastering facility, which Gateway Mastering was, all those years. And I knew I wanted to be at a place like that where I could learn from a mentor that was considered, somebody that really, basically wrote the book on it, of what mastering is. And I like to liken that as to like a Harvard education in mastering, with already having the UMass education as like the foundation.
Awesome.
So go ahead, Bunny. Do you have another one?
Good.
Okay. So I have a ton of questions just on what you said so far, but I want to just take a step back and
Sure.
for people who don't know, what is mastering and why is it needed for albums or for songs?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So in that, it's interesting because it is such a niche part of the industry. Very few people really do fully understand it. So
Right.
I love explaining it and in really simple terms, or really the simple way that I think really does a good job of framing what it is I consider mastering, or it is the last creative step in the process of making a record. So it's the last chance to change things sonically and to make a positive creative impact sonically on a recording. So if you think about all the steps in a recording, pre-production, I like to always remember people as one of the most important steps before you even start recording. But then you record all your tracks, you then mix all the tracks, which balances them all together. You do a lot of, whether it's effects and other processing, that's output to stereo. And then it's given to a mastering engineer like myself. And that's the last time somebody should be doing anything that changes the sonics and anything that enhances them. And so it's the last creative step in the process of making a recording. But then there's also the back end of it, which is the first creative step in getting, well, in these days, it's mostly digital distribution, getting those final masters in a format that's best for digital distribution. Though that said, almost all my clients are still also making CDs and making vinyl. So it's also prepping files and final masters that are best conducive to doing those things with again, maintaining the integrity of the sonics, in that first half of the process. So it's this creative process, and generally speaking, unless you're doing surround sound or Atmos, it's which is another iteration of surround sound, it's taking the stereo mix and kind of like fine tuning the equalizer in your car, just in a much more sophisticated and fine-tuned way, and imparting that last bit of sonic creativity.
So for example, you said a couple of things. For example, the variations of album recordings, whether it's a CD mix or whether it's an iTunes mastered for iTunes for digital and stuff like that. Are you doing multiple mixes per song or multiple masters per song for different types of things?
Well, in most of those cases, the answer is yes and no. And the reason it's yes and no is because it depends on how you define master. So in terms of the creative part of the process, generally speaking, no. Now, there's room for interpretation or room for subjectivity there, but generally speaking, mastering the album or the single recording, whatever it might be, one time at the highest resolution possible. And then that is going to be the parent master to make all of the file sets that are needed for the various means of distribution. And in theory, aside from things going from the highest resolution to the lowest resolution in terms of what the distributors accept, the audio is all the same otherwise.
Okay.
So it's not a creative step anymore. It's more of a step of making the proper type of master. So mastering it gets thrown around in so many different ways because you'll hear mix engineers call their master, their main mix, their master mix.
Right.
And then, mastering engineers call it a master. But then it's, I've mastered the thing, but now I've got a master for CD and a master for vinyl and a master for the digital distributors. But really, in terms of the creative part of the process, it's usually just one. And I say usually because there are exceptions to every rule. These days, if there's an exception, it's usually with a vinyl. Like occasionally an artist might be hip to making a slightly different sonic version for vinyl, though those are few and far between. But it's mainly one mastering creatively and then being able to output the various masters that are needed, which are these days file sets to
Right.
go to all the different places they need to go.
So for like 5.1 Atmos and stuff like that, that's a whole separate master. Is that right? Or is
That is totally a whole separate
Right.
master. That's an independent mix and an independent master.
Yeah, and that's
right. And I've done a ton of 5.1 mastering. I haven't tipped my toe into Atmos just yet. I have. Yeah, I mean, I see that. I know a lot of folks that are doing a lot of Atmos. I've had a lot of clients ask me about it. I just haven't made the step in that direction, though. I've done a lot of 5.1, but those are all unique mixes and unique masters. That's right. Yeah. So you can't derive. And that's a really good question to ask because sometimes I'll have folks be like, okay, you mastered the stereo. Now give me the Atmos. And I have to explain to them, and it's rightfully so because it's new technology, but like, oh no, that's you have to actually mix it that way. It's a completely different animal. So
I have a bunch of technical sort of questions. I don't know if Bonnie, if you want to jump in before I go too deep down a rabbit hole. But when it comes to an artist supplying you with their master for you to master,
the
you
master
probably
mix,
get a wide variety of things. But is there a standard people should be giving you, or that you prefer, or anything, or is it just whatever?
Oh, on the technical side, it's really easy. I generally prefer stereo wave file. Wave files have become an industry standard for a long time now. So stereo wave file, and then always at the highest resolution that it was recorded and mixed at. And that's really important. And occasionally, a mix engineer can, we're all human, we make errors. Occasionally I'll get something and it'll be 16-bit, the bit depth, as opposed to 24-bit. And these days it should be a minimum of 24-bit for me to work from. And often that's just, it's easy to make a mistake and choose 16-bit when you output a mix or something. But I always tell clients, send it to me the way, ultimately the theory is that if you recorded it at a certain sample rate and you recorded it at 24-bit, which is hopefully how you did it, then that should follow suit all the way to what you send to me. And in fact, that's exactly how I'm going to master it as well. So then, especially those digital distributors that will play full high res, we can give them the native sample rate and native bit depth through, I've mastered it exactly that way. And then from that, I can make the lower sonic quality versions if needed. Yeah.
And I'm looking at your list, and you have stuff that's remasters too. So you might have some old stuff that you're dusting off to send to you. Maybe it's off of vinyl, like you mentioned earlier, or something like that. How are you attacking those types of things?
Well, mostly those are usually off of tape, off of analog tape, and the process by which to attack those creatively, in my opinion, is, unless told otherwise, I would always have a copy of the original recording. And I've been privileged to remaster a lot of like really, really well-known recordings. And I do think that you should take the vantage point of giving some respect to the way it always lived in the world, unless that was bad for some reason. And usually those records sound amazing. Some of these big hit records. So what I generally like to do is I don't often like to sully myself with the way it sounded like before right off the bat. I like to just start doing what feels right to me, but then always do my homework and hear like what did it sound like before and what was the magic of it before. And then a lot of times it's trying to decode that. I don't know that. I've been given the tapes or a high res file set of a transfer of the tapes, and I'm doing what feels right to me, and then wanting to respect where it was before, and then wanting to enhance it and make it even better than it was before. So it's a combination of all of those things. I'd like to think whenever I've remastered something, I beat it sonically and made it better. And beat it sonically usually means like that you get more out of it emotionally. And when a listener listens to it, they get more, whether it's whatever the feeling should be when they listen to it, the excitement or whatever it is, there's more of it. And of course, being that some of those recordings are really older, both the analog and digital technology has gotten so much better that there's a lot of getting more of what was on the tape, what the intention was of the artist and the producer and the recording and mix engineer, than you could have got originally. So it's a combination of those things. How do I make this thing better? How do I, make sure that I'm respecting what was there before, or what was the magic that was there? I don't want to lose that in this process. Right. And then just make it all a better listening experience for everybody involved, which is like anybody that's going to play the record from that point on.
Right. Hey, I just want to jump in here real quick and say that if you're enjoying the show, please check us out on all podcast locations and on YouTube. Search for Tales from the Pit podcast. Please remember to like and subscribe. It helps us grow the show. All right, back to the show. I'll ask you when you got started, but the difference in equipment today versus maybe when you got started. So mastering back then, were you mastering on tape back then, or were you digital when you started?
A combination of both, but I would say a lot of stuff was coming in on tape. I mean, at some point, for me, early in my career, it was probably well more than 50% was coming in on tape. So we would get, generally speaking, like to think about the way the process worked, on any given weekday morning, FedEx at like 9:30 in the morning would drop off a dozen or so tapes that were all the mixtapes. We'd get those and master from those, and then by like 7 or 7:30 at night, ship out CDs to everybody that was integral in the approval process via FedEx, all the way until the mid-aughts to maybe the early 2010s for sure. But by about the mid-aughts, we started doing things on FTP servers so clients could push files up to us and retrieve files from us. And now everything is that way. Everything is that way. So everything is digital. When I've remastered something, when I was still at Gateway, often I would get tapes, but in the past several years, record labels were really reluctant to let the tapes out of the vault because they're getting so old and fragile, and they've done a good job of transferring them over the years. Sometimes you can get the artist directly involved or the original producer to kind of harangue the record label into sending you the tapes. But in the last couple of years, I found that it was getting a little harder to do. I was really getting sick of working from the tapes. And I can think of like one instance where, it was with a big record label that had their own engineers on staff that were really good at transferring, and actually really good mastering engineers as well. And I was like, oh, if you can have those guys transfer the tapes, then I don't have to deal with the tapes. And I'll tell them I know the exact tape machine I want it to be transferred from, the exact analog to digital converter. And I know they have these things where we can rent them for the, this process. And So completely got away from tape in the past couple of years. But back in the day, it was definitely more than half tape, half digital. I mean, like substantially more, at least in the early part of my career.
Yeah, I mean the technology has changed. All the plugins, there's a million plugins for everything nowadays too. I was listening to some of your earlier podcasts with Isotope and stuff like that.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah,
those guys are great, and I've been one of the outspoken folks in mastering, at least for like over 15 years, and it kind of ends up blowing people's minds. Like if I mentioned the AES, like if I go and speak on a panel at the AES convention or something for the Recording Academy or whatever, if it's multiple mastering engineers, it's always asked, like, what is your signal path like? Yeah. And they get to me and I'm like, I'm doing everything in the box now. And I still have all this great analog gear. In fact, I think I just got to start selling it because it's just sitting collecting dust because I never turn it on anymore. And I started doing that really early on because digital just got so good that I'm getting better results for it.
Yeah, I remember when, all the plugins were just starting and you just didn't have the warmth that you had like today. Now everything's, simulated and stuff like that. But back then it was just like, it was fuzzy and it didn't have the warmth of a real, amp or whatever. But yeah, so jumping back to, you started with probably one of the all-time greats with Bob Ludwig.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, that's like the master of mastering to get to kind of put yourself to get that experience out there and stuff like that. Was when you started with Bob back then, were you mastering or were you sort of doing any other things as well? Was it a studio back then, or was it only mastering back then?
It was only mastering. Gateway had always only been mastering, and I had worked before I got to Gateway. I was working at a recording studio. I was working in a mastering studio in Boston, and I was doing other gigs around the Boston area, like on location recording and things like that. And I knew I wanted to be at a place like Gateway. Gateway was at the very top of my list too, but I knew I wanted to be at a place like that. And got to know Bob a little bit in that experience of having him come speak at UMass. And so it ended up being this great story of keeping in touch with people. When I graduated from UMass, and finished my internship for graduation, kind of had an exit interview with the director of the program. And I remember him saying to me at that time, he was like, if you're ever thinking about, you've got some gigs already, but if you're looking for a different changing career or change geographically, like always keep in touch with me. Sometimes things come across my desk. And about a year out, I just sent him an email. I was just like, checking in with him, saying, hey, and saying, I'm doing these things and they're all working out well and I'm enjoying them, but I really just know I want to be at a world-class mastering facility and I'm willing to move wherever. So if you happen to hear of anything, let me know. And he happened to hear that Bob was hiring somebody at Gateway for a job as a production engineer. So that was my first job. And that job entailed what we called quality control. Back then, the final masters were all for CD. It was pretty much only CD. And we put the final mastering on a 3/4 inch U-matic videotape. So his digital audio was basically morphed into black and white video on this particular machine. And the job was to run those masters down and do quality control, which is listen with headphones, make notes on all the things that you think you hear that, maybe need to be checked before this final master goes out and or fixed. And then otherwise that the plant needs to know when they get the final master. And it's a pretty heavy job. Like I had been doing that at this other mastering facility. So at any rate, I heard about that job. Basically, once I heard about it, it was like, mailed, faxed, and emailed my resume. Did pretty much everything without being obnoxious, and then ended up going through the interview process with however many other engineers, and then luckily was the guy that got the gig. But that was how I started out, and that was in August of 1998. And I was 22, and I knew I wanted to be a mastering engineer. And again, in fact, like I think of all these things, these like seeds that you plant or connections you keep up. When I was interviewed for that job, I was asked by Bob and his wife, Gail, that was the studio manager there, where do you see that? It's sort of very common. Where do you see yourself in 5 years question? And I like to joke now and say, well, I didn't want to be as brash as to say it like own the place, but I knew I wanted to be a mastering engineer. and or somewhere in that time period, get a chance to be Bob's assistant and learn the craft from him. And so the whole way my career went there, and I look back at it, it went very quickly, but I started out as a production engineer, just doing the QC stuff. And then there was this sort of opportunity where Bob wanted to have an engineer in the room with him as an assistant. Because I planted that seed, I was the first one asked to do it, even though I was kind of the junior there. And then very quickly, we both realized I had an aptitude to master. So no, I didn't start off as a mastering engineer. I started off at that entry level position of doing quality control, but got these opportunities and seemingly was a good fit for those opportunities. And so from August of 98, starting there, to jump ahead to August of 2001, we opened my mastering room at Gateway because I was bringing in enough work to have my own room to work out of. And back then, when you were 22, it's at least for me, being like really motivated and ambitious, I was like, this can't happen fast enough. And I look back at it, I'm like, oh my gosh, that happened in the first 3 years. So yeah, I wasn't a mastering engineer. Even at the other mastering facility, what was great was where I think I had a leg up in terms of that quality control process was I was already doing it for well over a year. That was kind of, one of my main gigs at the other mastering facility I was at. So I had a good ear for that and a concept of that, and also knew the equipment and editing and like other things that are part and parcel of that. But I definitely didn't start out as a mastering engineer at Gateway. It took, but it went very quickly. It took just a couple of years.
Nice. Do you have a question, Bonnie?
I was just going to comment. That's pretty cool. And I think a lot of times that's what we hear is just that ambition that, get you where you want to go. Do those quality control positions still exist? Like those are stepping stones to becoming a master?
Yeah, absolutely. They do. In fact, it's just the beginning of this year, I hired my first assistant, and his main gig right now is doing the quality control for me at my place. So,
that's awesome.
Yeah, and he's doing a great job of it. It's working out really well. But that is usually the beginning. Like there's sort of the entry level position in mastering is if you have the ears and the understanding as to what you should be listening for. Because again, it is like a heavy process. And back then it was all early computer technology. This is before, everybody had the ability to record in their computer. It was actually several years before that, like 5 or 6 years before it started to become really a thing, even in the professional side of things. So mastering studios were one of the first places that had digital audio workstations, where you worked with digital audio in a computer. And I bring that up just because back then, this still can happen now, but hardly ever happens. The technology was so rudimentary. Like sometimes I'd be QCing something, as it was coming off the computer onto the tape, and there'd be like a digital hiccup, like as if you had a scratch CD, that sort of thing. Like those kinds of things could happen because the hard drives, could be fragmented, like things that we don't deal with anymore now, but are things like you can't be sleeping on that job. And especially if you're working in a place like Gateway, where it's like, here's this final master that's going to go to like 6 plants across the world and is going to get pressed certainly in the hundreds of thousands right off the bat, and you're going to be the one to blame if you didn't catch something. So even though it's the entry level job, it's a hard job. And I think it actually builds like some really good tenacity and character for anybody that does it.
The amount of artists you have, Taylor Swift, Foo Fighters, Def Leppard, Journey. Pretty much any artist you name, you've probably touched them. At what point are you involved? Is it after they're? You've kind of already answered this, but are you thought of before the recording is finished, or are you just brought in after the recording is done?
Well, usually I'm brought in after the recording is done to do the work. Oftentimes I'm thought of before it's done or while it's in the process. And most of my gigs come to me from record producers. Now, it's mix and match of different things, but if I were to point to one person in the process that usually chooses the mastering engineer, it's the record producer. Though that said, especially these days where more and more things are being done indie, it can be the artist, it could be the recording or mix engineer, occasionally somebody at a record label. But I think that a lot of times, and I certainly know that, folks will reach out a little earlier on in the process to get on the schedule. And make sure they can get on the schedule. So I think I'm thought of earlier in the process, but there are also days where, today's Tuesday, I could get an email tomorrow and it could be like, we just finished this thing and we forgot to reach out to you sooner, but we're who we want to master it, excuse me. Can you get in with us? Can I get in with you within a few days or whatever? And I accommodate as best as I can, especially for clients I've been working with for a long time because I absolutely adore them. But that happens a lot too. So it's like sometimes it feels like you're not even thought of until the end of the process, but usually you're being thought of through the process, but you're not actually doing it until the very end. Now that said, I do have a lot of clients, and I think that this is a great way to maintain relationships. And for me personally, to feel even more creatively and emotionally invested in a project. I have a lot of clients where I'm like, if you're in the process and you need another set of ears to put on it earlier in the process, I'm always here for you. You can always reach out to me. I'm always happy to within a couple of days, put an ear on a couple of mixes, give you some constructive criticism or some, the blessing that it's all good, or here are some things I might take a look at if it were me, to help. It helps the whole process, move that much better. And in this day and age, where clients are working on all these different places, and those clients being, say, the record producers and the mixers and the artists themselves, they might find themselves in environments that they're not comfortable with yet, or in a new environment that they just stepped into. And they need a little feedback on what things are sounding like. Like, we think we know what this room and these speakers sound like. And so I've always, told my clients, don't hesitate, just let me know. So I have a lot of instances where somebody might reach out to me, months before they're quite ready, or certainly at least weeks while they're mixing, and start to ask for some feedback on their mixes. And I love doing that because, number one, it's going to make the whole thing better at the end. My masters can only be as great as the mixes.
Yep.
It gives me more opportunities to interface with my clients, which I love to do. And it does really, there's something warm about it that makes me feel like I'm a little more invested in it than maybe the average thing.
Do your clients physically come to you, or are you just mixing it and sending it out? Do you have clients that actually sit with you to kind of go through the process?
That does happen occasionally. Right now that I'm in the interim spot that I'm in, I'm not doing attended sessions. But once I get into a permanent spot, I'll go back to doing them. And at Gateway, we hadn't done them since pre-COVID. But I would say in the normal days before COVID, I would say maybe 10 to 15, sometimes 20% of the projects might be attended. The vast majority of the work, obviously, I can just, or all of it, I can just do on my own. But I'd find clients even if they just want to come for the hang, or come, a lot of times I'd hear they want to come and hear it on my speakers in my room in a place that, they've never heard it sound that way before. I in the past have done a lot of distance running. I like to liken it to a marathon. I'm the friend in the last couple of miles that jumps in and pulls you over the finish line. And it's fun when somebody comes for that. So I guess the answer is, vast majority of the time, no. But when I'm in a spot where I can have attended sessions, I love having clients come, and somewhere between 10 and 20% on average, I guess.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So then I call you at the last minute. I'm like, Adam, I need you, right?
Yeah.
How long is it going to take for you to master something? If it's one song or a whole album, how long does that typically take you?
Oh, that's a great question. These days I'm telling clients to do a song, which comes up often because everybody's doing bite-sized stuff, and releasing singles. I can usually get a single in within a week. In terms of the time it takes me to actually do the work, it's like half an hour to an hour to do at least the initial session. And then maybe there's a little back and forth after that, another half an hour at most. So for singles, I usually tell clients, I can usually get those in within a week, sometimes a little faster. If it's an emergency, you need it right away, because that, we joke about emergencies in this business, but in the reality of it, it's the entertainment industry. And there are times where it's like, you get to strike while the iron's hot, or something good's happening for the artist, or something's catching fire that they weren't expecting in terms of popularity. And you want to get right on it. So singles I can do within about a week. I usually tell clients for an album, depending on the time of year, it can be 2 to 4 weeks, but don't ever hesitate to just reach out to me and let me know. I can always pencil you. Like, if you're starting mixing now and you think you're going to need me in 6 weeks, I'm going to pencil you in for 6 weeks from now. And I like to tell them, pencil them in, because, if you get to that point and, inevitably something's going to slow the process, we can always just move it around. And you're already in my purview and on my schedule. I'll make sure it's, still working in your time frame. Yeah. But it happens much more quickly than you would think. The process itself happens much more quickly than most people would think, but getting on the schedule, or how far out I'm booked, just because of the nature of being at the end of the process. Again, usually I'm getting those phone calls or those emails. It's like, can you do it next week or within a week or two? Because now we're at that point where we need it. I'm finding that larger scale, like album projects, 2 to 4 weeks out at most.
With 67, at least 67 Latin Grammy Awards for albums you've mastered so far. Yeah. Can you hear that song as you're because you hear so much stuff, you get so much stuff.
Sure.
Is it just a mix of everything and it's hard for you to determine, or do you hear that song that's going to be at Grammy?
That's a great question. And I think it's really hard, especially now, to know what's going to happen because there are so many things in play. I think of like Bob and folks of his generation that I've talked to over the years that in like the 80s or 90s could say, they'd hear something and be like, this is going to be a hit. And the music business has changed so much since then that I can definitely hear things and be like, this really moves me. And I also know what moves a lot of people. So I could say, well, this could be, quote unquote hit, whether that means it's going to do really well streaming or win a Grammy or whatever. But there's so much that goes into that cauldron of those things happening that it's hard to say that that's actually what's going to happen. And there's always surprises. There's always things where there certainly has never been a thing where I'm like, I can't believe that won a Grammy. No, they all are so deserving of it. But what becomes really hard is in this day and age to pinpoint like, oh, this particular recording, this song or this album, this is going to move a lot of people. There's so many factors into how that gets to, especially today where it's so fractured. It's no longer everybody's listening to 3 FM stations or whatever in their market, and everybody's buying the same records and the whole thing. It's so fractured now. It's really hard to tell what's going to catch the lightning in the bottle in terms of that type of success. But certainly when I listen to something that's good, I know it's good. There's, I'll listen to things on a daily basis and be like, well, this has a lot of potential to mean something to a lot of people. And whether that ends up being, it goes as far as winning a Grammy or being a number one hit or whatever, that's so much harder to tell now. That's out of my control.
Right. I mean,
it's above my pay grade.
Right. So for Grammy, were you able? So when your work is nominated, are you able to attend the Grammys?
I mean, in general, I'm a Recording Academy member, so in general, I could attend anytime. Just would have to pay for tickets,
Sure.
and get myself out there. When I'm nominated, so when a recording's nominated, it doesn't actually mean that I'm nominated.
Sure.
So I generally speaking, I've only gone when I have been nominated,
Yep.
just because it's special. It's, that's when I really want to go is when I've been nominated, and you do get invited at that point. And it is a special thing. In fact, last year, around, well, I guess a little earlier than this. So February of 2023, not this past Grammys, but the year before, I was nominated in the category of Best Engineered Album, Non-Classical, which is one of those ones for us nerdy engineers is a big feather in the cap, for a Father John Misty album that it was definitely one that's like, it's deserving of that nomination and or a win. We didn't get the win, but I ended up going out and taking my whole family, took my wife and my 2 kids, who are teenagers. And I was just like, we've got to make the most of this and go to the show this time. So yeah, you mentioned the 67, like basically that's 67 recordings that have won either a Grammy or a Latin Grammy that I was the mastering engineer on, but I certainly don't have ownership of 67 Grammy Awards. If they would change the rules, maybe I would, but I have 6 of them.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about your experience at the Grammys?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been a number of times.
What was your day like?
This last time, what was our day like? It's a long day, first of all. It all runs on Pacific time because you're in California. And there's the Grammy show that we all know and love that we watch on TV that starts at 8 p.m. Eastern time, but 5 West Coast time. But leading up to that, starting at 1 p.m. is the pre-broadcast show. It's an in-person show. Nowadays, they live stream it as well. And that's where if they give out, it's like 95 or 97 Grammys every year now, or 95, 97 categories. That's where, 80 something of them, or 85 of them or something, or maybe even more these days, are given out at that pre-broadcast. So the day is basically like, for me this year is, we stayed in Santa Monica, which I love, going out and running along the ocean there to just kind of get my head in the right place. Then really just like, let's get into town, because it's a little like all the roads start getting blocked off. So it's basically a really long day. We were probably at the event, certainly before 1 o'clock when it started, probably noon, until about, let me think. So till about 9 o'clock that night, basically in town. And the great thing now is that downtown LA at least has some restaurants and some things. Back in the day, like the first few times I went, there's nothing really to do down there. And the hardest thing is just like staying fueled, because that pre-broadcast show goes on for so long. Once we realized I didn't get my Grammy, we hung out for a little while longer at the pre-broadcast, and then the four of us went and got some lunch before anybody got hangry, and then went back and watched the rest of the pre-broadcast, and then the full broadcast, which is in the crypto.com arena now. But at any rate, so that's sort of like what the day looks like. It's a really, really long day. And then there's also an after party that you can go to. We didn't go because we had the kids with us, but usually we would go to the after party that goes on for another 2 or 3 hours. So and at least they have some food there. It's a very, very long day. It's not very glamorous.
Man.
I'm sure maybe it's more glamorous for the rock stars and the pop stars, but it's for the rest of it's not. I mean, it's fun. Don't get me wrong. I wouldn't trade it for anything, but it's not it's a very long, arduous day, but it is a lot of fun. And I like to tell people, because I'm a tech nerd, like it's a really fun show to watch. Especially the broadcast show is really fun to watch. If you've never seen something like that happen in real time in front of your eyes, it's really remarkable. Everything from seeing, they sort of have like 2 different stages that they wall off. So there's, you're watching one performance, and sometimes they can be these big, almost, theatrical or like Vegas type show things with a lot going on. And then the other stage is covered up, and you can see the shadows of all the people working really, really hard to set up the next big thing that's going to come right after that. And just seeing how the whole thing goes down in person from a person, there's the standpoint of somebody who's really interested in the technical side of things, that's a really fun experience too. So there's a lot of cool things to see. There are a lot of great music to hear, of course, both pre-broadcast and the regular broadcast. A lot of people watching, a lot of really cool people there. I took my oldest son on the red carpet with me. He wanted to go, and it's just like his mind was, it's like, there's Jack Harlow is, within 10 feet of him. And that was really a cool experience for him. And we got photos taken together on the red carpet, which is really awesome. That's a really special photo. And the 4 of us did photos while we were there as well. So it's like a really cool experience all around.
That's
but
awesome.
Bring snacks if you can.
Did you get starstruck over anybody at the Grammys? Or like, oh, it's so cool to see?
Well, when my son and I were in the line and the red carpet to have our photos taken, Nancy Wilson was right next to me, of Heart, and I'm a huge fan of the band Heart.
Sure.
And in fact, actually, so at this particular year, and forgive me if I'm going on too long, but the night before they always do a special award show as well that my wife and I went to, and that's where they give out like Lifetime Achievement Awards and other technical awards that aren't even in the pre-broadcast and aren't on the broadcast, though they usually mention them thankfully in the broadcast. And Heart was given a Lifetime Achievement Award, so as was Nirvana. As was the Supremes. And like, that was like just a really awesome show the night before. And I didn't get a chance to get up close to Nancy then. And unfortunately, Anne didn't attend. I was really hoping they'd both be together for that moment, and they weren't. But when we were on the red carpet line, I just happened to turn around and as close as another person could be to me was Nancy Wilson. So I just took that as an opportunity to just be like, thank you for all the awesome music you've made.
Yeah. You tell her, well, I can sonically make it a little bit better next time. If you want.
I should have taken that opportunity to be like, I love those records. Have you thought about remastering them? I'm your guy.
That's awesome. So I'm just curious. So you mentioned running and you mentioned your family. So what are you doing outside of the studio when you're not mastering and it's not freezing, snowing? doing
Right,
whatever
I
it does
know.
in Portland.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I do obviously spend a ton of time with my family, so I'm home a lot, which is great, which is also what's awesome about mastering is you actually sort of stay in one place. It's like a lot of producers will travel around to wherever they and the artists want to work. Same thing with recording and mix engineers. Mastering engineers, actually by default, you want to be in the same place so you can be that sort of sonic consistency. So I spend a lot of time with my family. Of course, I do love running. Living in Portland, so awesome. I don't live too far from, all these great trails to run, walk, or cycle on, and I do all three of those things. I like to paddleboard, which is a lot of fun. I love being on the ocean. That's really great. And honestly, days like today, I did run today, which I didn't run a lot this winter for a lot of different reasons, but I would normally do a lot of those things. Well, I'm not cycling or paddleboarding. I should say not a lot of those things, but at least running through the miserable days of the winter. Just this past year, I haven't had the inclination to do it. But I like to just stay active because actually I think that kind of speaks to what happens when you get into the studios. You're not very active. You're sitting the whole time. It's like when I'm in the studio and I'm working, I'm sitting down, I'm really focused on listening. I'm really focused on doing what I'm doing. So when I'm not in the studio, I love to spend time outside. And Portland and Maine is just in general a great place to be, to do all those things. And like I said, you just walk out your door and you can do them. So
Yeah, for sure.
I want to ask a few more questions, and then we can close it up. But just kind of some curious questions for that my weird brain thinks about. First, odd question is: do you master with your eyes open or closed? Does that matter?
You're
that's
right.
a great
That
question.
was odd.
Yeah.
It was
When I say that, I say that because when I'm mixing, I close my eyes.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good question and one I've been asked before. And a lot of times most of the time my eyes are open because I'm doing something and I need to see what I'm doing. But that said, when I'm getting to one of my last listens where it's like completely done, if I'm really feeling it and I'm not feeling the need to close my eyes, it's not a thing where like I feel I need to close my eyes, but a lot of times I do. To see your weirdness and double down on it, one thing that I've always found interesting is the amount of light that my eyes take in while I'm working does something psychologically to how I hear things. So I tend to like to keep my environment kind of vibey and a little darker. Like I have some colored lights too that I just like kind of for the vibe of them, but I keep things dim for that reason. And I do use a giant flat screen for my Pro Tools for my plugins. And it took me a little bit to get used to that. I've been doing that for many, many, many years now. But many years ago when I started using it, I had to sort of like fuss with the brightness a little bit because something about, I don't know, there's something psychological. I have to see if there's any research done on it, but the more light coming at you sometimes feels like it does something psychologically.
There's a stimulant happening.
There's a stimulant, exactly, 100%. So for that reason, I mean, I don't shut my monitors off, and I have so many monitors going now because everything's on computers. I've adjusted and gotten used to that. It took me a little while to get used to, but I think as a way to combat that, I've just progressively have kept my workspace that much dimmer and darker, just because I think I just like it vibe-wise. I don't like a lot of bright light anyways, and I like softer lights in general, but there's definitely something to that. And I'll add to that real quickly and just saying that I've been doing this for long enough that I had mentioned doing it before we were doing it on computers, which for most, not even young people anymore, that's a foreign concept because being able to record in the computer has been around for so long now. But I love the fact that I was doing it before then because I didn't have my face in a computer screen and I didn't like sort of a tangent on your question, but something a little bit different than the psychological thing is this with just light, but the psychological thing of looking at audio.
Yeah.
I think is a lot of people get caught up in that. And having come from this place where I was tweaking and adjusting things sonically before ever doing it on a computer, I didn't let visuals sway my creative decisions. And I get that from younger folks now, or at least younger than me that have been doing it in a computer their entire time. I'm like, sometimes just shut the screen off, and not because of the light part of it, but just like, don't let those things dictate how you make things sound.
And that was, and that's exactly sort of the point of my question, because one of my problems I used to have was I would see the peaks and I would anticipate the peaks and I would be ignoring what I'm currently listening to evaluate that peak. And I'm like, oh, I need to just stop looking and just feel what's coming through.
Absolutely. And the reason I'm glad, like, I think maybe I initially misunderstood your question more about the vibe and the sort of impact of light, but I completely agree. And that's what I was getting at as well, is I think it's a really important thing. Don't let the graphics and the visuals on your computer dictate how you're hearing things, because it's almost impossible to disconnect if you don't just look away from it.
There's almost a translation too, for both Bonnie and I are music photographers. We're photographers in general.
Sure, yeah.
And there's a translation to how much light is surrounding your photo that impacts the actual photo itself.
Yeah.
So, we can certainly translate that from audio to from a visual to an audio situation, or vice versa as well. So I certainly see that across multiple art forms.
Absolutely. And mastering is great. I'm glad you mentioned that you're both photographers, and of course I knew that about you, Jason, but the thing that's interesting is another way to explain what mastering is sort of like what you do in Photoshop. If you do anything in terms of touching up the color and other things within Photoshop, I don't necessarily mean, doing the Kate Middleton Photoshop thing. And just going in and adjusting light and making those subtle changes that creatively make some differences. That's exactly what mastering is, just with audio.
Basically, you're removing wrinkles from photos.
Right, exactly. There you go. I'm removing wrinkles from music.
That's right. Put that on your page. You'll get everyone will be wanting you.
Right, exactly.
Every remaster will go through you.
Yes, I'll have to put that on the website.
So my second sort of odd question, which I don't think is odd, is more related to your ears. Now you're listening to stuff over and over and over again. Do you have a regimen for your ears? Do you have some sort of practice for your ears to sort of keep your ears neutral? Are you tuning your ears, anything like that?
I mean, for the most part, I can usually just like hit play and get going, and I'm already sort of tuned into what I'm doing. If for some reason I feel the need to tune my ears, there are a lot of recordings that I know so well that I might just pull up and listen to a couple of minutes of, just to be like, okay, let me just get my bearings. That usually happens if I'm dealing with a mix that I'm really struggling with and I need a little frame of reference. I might bring something up, but I've been doing this for so long now that I usually just plop myself down and get right into it. But to your point, the regimen part of it is having little breaks in between things, which sometimes means just like, checking an email or responding to a text, knowing that like a sonic break is good for me right now. It means not working really long hours, not working very loudly either. I mean, I work maybe a little more loudly than some mix engineers do, though I'm sure there are plenty that listen a lot more loudly than I do, but I listen at a relatively reasonable level. And just knowing like when I'm done, and it's usually not my ears that burn out, it's my brain. It's the level of focus that it takes. I usually know that point in my day where it's like, I'm not going to get 100% out of myself right now, so it's a good time to stop if I can. And it's usually more about the focus part of my brain being like, okay, I'm done.
Let me ask one more technical question, and I'll let Bonnie close this out. And this is probably a can of worms here, this question, but AI, is that impacting mastering? Does that impact you? I know the whole industry, every art form has an AI question, but how does that impact you?
So far right now, I don't think it impacts me at all. I mean, there is at least one company out there that's doing this sort of online, upload your mix, we'll master it. And there was one company doing that for quite some time now. I want to say at least 15 years. And I remember that this is pre-AI though, but similar concept. And I remember like the day they announced it, I was just getting blown up with messages from folks like, how does this affect you? I'm like, I don't think it does, but I don't know yet. And very quickly, everybody realized that algorithm did a really terrible job. Yep. It did not do anything that a mastering engineer should or can do, or a good one at least. I'm not foolish enough to think that AI isn't so powerful that it couldn't, that I shouldn't be thinking about that. But I still think that so much of what I do is there's such a creative element to it and human part of it that I'm not fearful of it, but I just don't know yet. So like I said, there is one company that claims they're doing a similar type of thing, but now with AI. And I'll be interested to see how that shakes out. I'll be interested to see how it shakes out, because as we all know, AI is going to change everything in one way or another, hopefully for the positive. But at this point, I don't see it affecting my work. And to that point, I don't have any tools that I use that are AI tools. That might actually be a really positive effect if somebody starts developing some really good AI tools that help me do my job. Yeah. But I don't know of anybody that's doing that right now.
Right.
I'll see what happens with AI. I'm sorry, Bonnie, go ahead.
That's okay. So speaking of right now, so what do you have coming up in 2024? Anything you're excited about?
Yeah, I mean, every day. Yeah, well, I do. I usually wait until there are announcements about what's coming out, and there's a handful of records coming out over the next couple of months that I'm really excited about. One of them is a new album for Shakira that's coming out this week, actually. One is an album for Amos Lee that comes out this summer. It was the first time he's so great. It's the first time I've had an opportunity to work with him or work on his music, and I really loved it. Loved the whole process with him. There's an artist from Australia named Grace Cummings, who's sort of singer-songwriter, who made, I think, a really phenomenal and unique album called Ramona that comes out in a couple of weeks. I'm really excited about that one. Jason mentioned Journey. I've been doing a lot of remasters with Journey. Their greatest hits remaster just came out. And that's one that I've gotten a ton of street cred for as of recently. Nice. So they're always I'm fortunate to have all this like really great music passing my ears, and then I just need to be careful what I talk about before it's released. But sure. That's a handful of those that are coming up. I don't know when you plan on airing this, but like that are coming up very soon that I'm really excited about in particular. And then, and I also want to say the other thing I'm just really excited about, and maybe we can revisit together sometime down the line, is finding that permanent space. And I'm getting closer, and I'll keep you guys posted. But that's my big 2024 goal. 2023 was launching, getting going, having all the clients follow me as they did, and a whole bunch of new clients. And now what I'm really excited about is to find that permanent spot for Ayan Mastering.
I would love to see that once you have it ready.
Once I do, I'll have you both come over. Maybe we can do this again sometime when it feels appropriate to you, and we'll do it there if you'd like.
Totally.
I'll keep you posted. That's one of my big hopes for 2024, and the thing I'm working really hard at right now.
Well, to be honest with you, I have about 30 more questions I could ask, so we'll save those for the next time.
Save it for the next one. Keep them wanting more. Well, this was so much fun. Thank you guys for having me. Yeah,
thank you so much for doing this. Like I said, you and I have been talking about doing this for probably over a year now, and I'm glad we could finally do it. And
yeah, me too.
Your work is anytime, being in a band myself, anytime anyone asks for mastering, your name is always the first, whether it be local or whether it be, doing all the major artists and stuff like that. Your name always pops up for everything. So,
that's so great.
Really awesome.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your work. I mean, obviously your work is phenomenal. So,
thanks so much.
We'll be looking out for your upcoming releases. So, awesome. Where can people find you?
Oh, great question. So ayanmastering.com is the website. I am on Facebook and Instagram as Adam. Facebook, I guess, is facebook.com/Adam Ayan. Instagram is Adam Ayan _master.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. This is so much fun.
Hey, thanks for watching this episode with Mastering Master Adam Ayan. We hope you enjoyed it. You can check out our other guests, our other episodes on all your favorite podcast locations and on YouTube. Search for Tales from the Pit Podcast. And on our website, talesfromthepit.net. Until the next time, we'll see ya. This episode was edited and produced by me, Jason Lavasser.